The ballroom shimmered under golden light, chandeliers casting soft halos on polished floors. A string quartet leaned into familiar classics, their bows tracing calm patterns through the air. Waiters moved like clockwork, balancing trays of champagne flutes and tiny hors d'oeuvres. At every table, old colleagues laughed, their voices carrying the relief of men and women who had worked hard, now allowed at last to loosen their ties. At the center of it all was Richard. Navy tuxedo, bow tie just off-kilter, enough to look human, glass in hand, grin wide. For 38 years he had been the company's anchor, the man others turned to when contracts faltered or tempers flared. Tonight, the banner on the far wall told the story. Congratulations, Richard, 38 years of service. To most in the room, he was a man to admire. To some, a man to envy. To Linda, standing just steps away at the lectern, he was something else entirely. She adjusted the microphone with careful precision. No. Guests clinked glasses. Chairs scraped across the floor as people gathered closer. A hush moved over the crowd, the kind of respectful silence saved for speeches and prayer. Richard leaned back in his chair, smug, his eyes glinting with pride. He thought he knew what Linda would say, a tender tribute, a wife's gentle praise, the closing line of a long career. He had no idea what was coming. The slideshow began on the big screen. Childhood photos, graduation day, the first gray suit, vacations, anniversaries, promotions. Faces softened with nostalgia. Someone dabbed at a tear. A room full of witnesses leaned in, expecting comfort. And then, the flicker. The next image froze them where they sat. Richard, hand entwined with a woman's, stepping into the glow of a hotel lobby. The woman, Susan, Linda's younger sister. The room erupted. Gasps. A glass shattered against the floor. Someone whispered, "Her sister?" with the kind of disbelief usually reserved for crime reports on the evening news. Richard lurched to his feet, face crimson, voice breaking. "Linda, what the hell is this?" But Linda didn't flinch. Her voice was steady, polished, deliberate. "This isn't gossip. This is truth. And tonight, the truth is the only thing worth celebrating." For Richard, the retirement party was meant to crown his legacy. For Linda, it was the stage for his undoing. And for everyone watching, it was the moment a long-kept secret became a very public crime story. To understand what happened that night, you have to know who Richard was, or at least who people thought he was. For nearly 4 decades, Richard was the kind of employee companies build monuments around. Dependable, tireless, a man with an instinct for numbers and an iron stomach for high-pressure negotiations. Colleagues told stories about the time he rescued a $1 million account in 09, or how he guided young analysts through storms that would have sunk other teams. The man with 9 lives, they called him, a joke said with respect. In photographs from his early years, Richard looked every bit the rising star. A broad smile, dark hair combed just right, handshakes captured in grainy Polaroids. Later the photos shifted, gray at the temples, glasses perched on his nose, but the smile never fading. He aged into authority, and authority suited him. At home, Richard played the role of reliable husband. 6:30 every evening, jacket draped over the chair, shoes neatly by the door. He kissed Linda's temple, loosened his tie, and filled the kitchen with steady chatter about meetings and deadlines. To neighbors and friends, they looked like a solid pair. She, elegant and composed. He, steady and successful. Linda, in many ways, was Richard's mirror. She handled the social fabric of their lives, the dinner parties, the holiday cards, the small touches that made them look like more than just a family, but a legacy. Over the years, she learned the art of smiling without fatigue, of listening without interrupting, of holding her head just high enough at company banquets. If Richard was the engine, Linda was the Polish. But reputations are costumes, and costumes only work while the lights are dim. Richard's colleagues knew him as loyal, tireless, dependable. Linda knew the man beneath that surface. Meticulous, proud, almost ritualistic. He lived by order. Breakfast at 7, work by 8, dinner at 6:30 sharp, Sundays for golf. Vacations to the same coastal town year after year. It wasn't just habit, it was identity. Richard was a man of routines, and routines gave Linda comfort. Because when you can predict a man, you can trust a man. At least she thought so. It's important to pause here, because this is where most true crime stories begin. Not with the crime itself, but with the rupture of routine. Investigators often say the first sign that something is wrong isn't blood or money or missing persons. It's the subtle break in habit. A phone call unanswered. A car parked where it shouldn't be. A spouse home late without the usual reason. For Linda, the rupture was small at first. Richard stayed late at the office. He claimed the younger analyst needed guidance, or that he had extra reports to file before retirement. Perfectly reasonable on the surface. Except Richard was a man who hated late nights. He prided himself on discipline. If he said he'd be home at 6:30, he was home at 6:30. For 30 years, until suddenly he wasn't. That was the first crack. She smoothed it over, told herself retirement was near, that maybe the company leaned harder on him. But the cracks multiplied. The phone always face down now, a new password on his laptop, new cologne after decades of the same aftershave. None of it screamed crime yet, not even infidelity. But the seed was planted. The night of the retirement party, Richard's reputation was on display. The speeches, the applause, the banner proclaiming his years of loyalty. But reputations can be masks. And behind Richard's mask, the truth was about to spill into the light. For 30 years, Richard's life could have been set to a clock. Every detail was predictable. The morning paper folded beside his coffee, the car pulling into the driveway at precisely 6:30, the kiss pressed against Linda's temple before he loosened his tie and sat down to dinner. That kind of predictability isn't just habit, it's comfort. Linda trusted it. She had built her own routines around his, timing the roast to be ready at 6:20, setting his glass of water by the right edge of the plate, leaving her calendar clear for evening conversation. A steady rhythm of days and decades. But routines, investigators often remind us, are like fingerprints. When they change, it means something. And Richard's began to change. At first, it was late nights. The young guys need help with projections, he said one Tuesday, rolling in closer to 9. Another week, he muttered something about reports the board needs before the quarter closes. Reasonable excuses if it had been anyone else. But for Richard, the man who prized coming home on time, they were suspicious. Then came the phone. For years, Richard left it anywhere, on the counter, beside the couch, sometimes still buzzing on the nightstand while he brushed his teeth. Now it was always face down, screen locked, set to silent. He carried it into the bathroom. He slept with it by his side of the bed. Linda noticed. Of course she did. And there were the scents. For 3 decades, Richard wore the same aftershave, a crisp, faint spice Linda once teased him for being too loyal to. Suddenly it was gone. In its place came something floral, expensive, not his taste at all. The first night she smelled it, Linda's breath caught in her throat. She recognized it instantly. It was the perfume she had helped her sister Susan choose on a shopping trip years earlier. Even small talk shifted. Richard, once eager to recount office squabbles or boast about new contracts, grew vague. His answers shortened, explanations blurred. Busy day. Lots to do. I'll tell you later. But later never came. For many wives, those signs might have led to confrontation. For Linda, they led to silence. She smiled, nodded, let him speak. But inside, she was storing the details like puzzle pieces, waiting to see what they built. It wasn't just the behavior. It was the weight of the inconsistencies pressing in from all directions. Investigators often say that in cases of fraud or betrayal, it isn't one red flag that catches their eye. It's the pattern. One inconsistency, maybe you excuse it. 2, maybe it's coincidence. But a dozen, that's design. One Sunday, Linda hosted lunch for the family. Susan arrived, as she often did, unannounced and bearing a casserole dish. She laughed too loudly at Richard's old stories, brushed his sleeve in the kitchen with a hand that lingered a second too long. At the time, Linda forced herself to smile, to keep the scene polite. But when she replayed it later in her mind, she couldn't ignore the intimacy in that glance, the way Susan leaned just slightly closer than necessary. The changes accumulated like stones in her chest. Richard working later, Susan dropping by more often, excuses that overlapped too neatly. Each detail might have been harmless on its own. Together they painted something darker. True crime often begins here, not with the discovery of evidence, but with instinct. A gut feeling that something is wrong. Detectives call it the itch. Linda felt it every night as she set Richard's plate down at an empty chair. Every morning when she smelled perfume that wasn't hers. Every Sunday when Susan smiled a little too brightly. By the time the cracks in Richard's routine had spread wide enough to see clearly, Linda no longer asked herself if something was happening. She began to wonder how long it had been happening, and how much worse it might become. What she didn't know yet was that the first undeniable proof would arrive soon, and when it did, it would come not in whispers or suspicions, but in black and white, glowing across the screen of Richard's own phone. For weeks, Linda lived with unease. She told herself not to jump to conclusions. After all, long marriages survive on patience. Maybe Richard really was working harder as retirement approached. Maybe Susan's visits were just sisterly kindness. But unease has a way of settling in the bones, and Linda's bones told her the truth. Something was wrong. The first undeniable clue arrived on a Tuesday evening. Dinner plates were stacked in the sink, and Richard had stepped out to take a shower. His phone, carelessly for once, lay face up on the counter. It buzzed. A preview flashed across the screen before fading. "Love you. Can't wait for our next night together, S." The words burned themselves into Linda's mind. For a moment she froze, her hand hovering above a plate she nearly dropped. Her pulse raced. She didn't need to open the message. The initial alone was enough. S. Susan. Her sister. The room seemed to tilt, the edges of her vision blurring, as if her body couldn't decide whether to fight or collapse. She wanted to tell herself it was a mistake, a wrong number, a joke, but Richard never let his phone out of his sight anymore. And Susan had been slipping into their lives with a frequency that now felt sinister. Linda forced herself to breathe. She didn't confront Richard, not then. She knew instinct wasn't evidence, and instinct wouldn't hold up if she needed to prove this later. To her children, to friends, to the company that revered him. She needed more. The second clue came less than a week later. Linda was dusting Richard's study, though she had already dusted that room days before. Something compelled her to check drawers she'd never touched. In the second drawer of his desk, beneath receipts and an old notebook, lay a small velvet box. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside rested a silver bracelet. Delicate, elegant, engraved on the inner band with 5 words. Forever SR. The letters carved into the metal felt heavier than the bracelet itself. Her stomach dropped. Air rushed from her lungs as though someone had pressed her against a wall. She closed the box carefully, returning it exactly as she'd found it. Every motion deliberate. Not confrontation. Not yet. Evidence. She walked out of the study with hands cold as ice. Her reflection in the hallway mirror almost unrecognizable. Her own eyes looked foreign, wide, disbelieving. The face of a woman betrayed not just by a husband, but by her own blood. True crime investigators often describe this moment as confirmation bias snapping shut. Suspicion is one thing, but once a person finds direct proof, texts, receipts, engraved jewelry, there's no going back. Every memory begins to reframe itself. Every past moment turns over, showing its darker side. That's what happened to Linda. The text message and the bracelet didn't just prove betrayal. They rewrote the past. Suddenly, she saw with clarity all the details she had ignored. And Susan dropping by unannounced with wine, laughing too loudly at Richard's jokes. Richard complimenting Susan's cooking as though she were the only woman who ever brought food to their table. Their glances across the room, brief but charged, now obvious in their meaning. It wasn't sibling warmth. It was secrecy in plain sight. Linda's world cracked in two. On one side, the smiling marriage, the dependable routines, the public respect. On the other, the hidden affair, the sister's betrayal, the silver bracelet engraved like a confession. She didn't scream. She didn't throw plates. Instead, she began to think like an investigator. If Richard could lie about this, what else could he lie about? If he could buy jewelry for another woman, whose money had he used? And if he was willing to risk everything so close to retirement, what had he already risked before? This is where Linda's story shifted from private heartbreak to potential crime. Affairs may destroy marriages, but financial deceit can destroy legacies. And in some cases, it can cross into criminal territory. That night, Richard came home late again, faintly scented with Susan's perfume. He kissed Linda's cheek, mumbled something about being exhausted, and retreated upstairs. Linda sat in the living room, silent, her mind replaying the message in the bracelet, her eyes fixed on the dark window. She didn't see her reflection anymore. She saw strategy. The first clues had been found. The investigation, whether Richard knew it or not, had begun. Once Linda saw the text message in the silver bracelet, she could no longer dismiss the unease as paranoia. It was real. The betrayal wasn't imagined. It was in black and white, etched in silver, documented in words no wife should ever have to read. But Linda didn't confront Richard. Not yet. She understood something that many true crime investigators know instinctively. Emotions cloud judgment, but patience builds cases. If she exploded now, Richard would cover his tracks. He would lock his phone tighter, move the bracelet, erase the trail. She didn't want excuses. She wanted evidence. So she began to watch. Not frantically, not with shouting or accusations, but quietly, methodically, the way you might water a plant a little at a time, knowing growth is inevitable. At first, she noticed the silences. Richard and Susan would stop talking when she entered the room. Their bodies would spring apart ever so slightly, like actors caught between lines. When she left again, voices dropped to whispers she couldn't quite hear. Once she stepped back suddenly, catching a brief exchange of glances before they rearranged their expressions into polite smiles. Then the touches, a hand brushing a sleeve, a shoulder leaned in too close, innocent gestures if seen in isolation. But Linda's eyes had been trained by betrayal. She knew the difference between casual contact and a current of electricity sparking under the surface. The visits too changed. Susan's drop-ins grew more frequent. A bottle of wine here, a bouquet of flowers there. Always with a laugh, always with an excuse. Just thought I'd stop by. Had extra from the garden. Harmless enough to the untrained eye. But Linda was no longer untrained. She was cataloging each one. And then came the whispers of routine breaking further. Richard left earlier for work, came home later. His excuses began to overlap with Susan's name. She needed help with boxes. Her car sounded strange. Linda nodded politely, but the lies burned holes in her composure. It was the little discoveries, though, that sharpened her instincts into certainty. One afternoon, while dusting the living room, a chore she'd already done the day before, her hands slipped beneath the sofa cushion. Tucked between fabric folds was a note, folded once, small and careless. The handwriting wasn't Richard's. It was Susan's. 6 words. I can't wait until forever. Linda unfolded the paper with trembling fingers, her eyes burning with rage. 6 words, and every doubt she had clung to fell away. It was no longer about suspicion. It was no longer about maybe. It was fact. Her husband and her sister were entwined in something that mocked her marriage, her family, her life. The weight of the note was disproportionate to its size. It sat on the coffee table, daring her to ignore it, daring her to pretend. But she didn't. She pressed it flat, memorized each curve of the letters, and then tucked it carefully away. Another piece of evidence. True crime often turns here, when suspicion becomes proof and proof demands response. Linda wasn't screaming. She wasn't weeping. She was building a file. Piece by piece, lie by lie, her case was forming. What stood out most wasn't Richard's carelessness, but Susan's. The note left behind. The perfume too obvious. The visits too frequent. It was sloppy. It was arrogant. And arrogance, investigators say, is often what undoes people in the end. From that day forward, Linda stopped wondering if she knew. The question became how far. How far had they gone? How far would they take it? And most importantly, how far was she willing to go to expose them? Her silence, once born of disbelief, had transformed into strategy. Every smile she wore in public, every nod she gave Richard, every polite exchange with Susan, each one was a mask, a shield hiding the fact that Linda was no longer the victim in this story. She was preparing to become its author. By late March, Linda had collected more than enough to convince herself. The text, the bracelet, the note under the cushion. But evidence in shadows is still easy to dismiss. People can explain away words. They can argue over intent. They can deny. What Linda needed was the kind of proof no denial could smother. Something undeniable, visual, lasting. The chance came on a damp Thursday evening. Richard announced over dinner that he had a late board meeting downtown. His voice was flat, casual, like a man who had rehearsed the excuse. Linda didn't argue. She didn't even look up from her plate. She simply nodded, the way she had a dozen times before, hiding the steel forming in her eyes. When the door shut behind him, she waited exactly 5 minutes. Then she rose, coat already by the door, purse packed with her phone, a notepad, and a pen. The investigator's kit of a woman who had finally chosen action. The night air was heavy with spring dampness, the kind that blurs streetlights into halos. Linda followed at a careful distance, headlights dimmed, pulse hammering against the steering wheel. Richard drove with calm ease, humming faintly to the radio, oblivious to the shadow trailing him. But he didn't head toward downtown. He didn't head toward the company offices. Instead, he drove 20 minutes out of town, past quiet suburbs and strip malls, to the edge of a highway exit where a discreet hotel squatted in the dark. Not luxury, not family-friendly, just anonymous enough for secrecy. Linda parked 3 rows back, engine cut, hands gripping the wheel until her knuckles whitened. She waited, eyes locked on Richard as he climbed from the car and adjusted his tie. For a moment she prayed, against all logic, that this wasn't what it looked like, that maybe he was meeting a client, a colleague, anyone but who she feared. Then the silver sedan pulled in. Linda's stomach dropped before the door even opened. She already knew. Her body recognized the timing, the inevitability. And then she saw her. Susan stepped out, hair styled, coat cinched, movements practiced like a woman dressing for an evening she'd anticipated. She glanced around quickly before spotting Richard waiting by the entrance. His face lit, not with the weariness of work, but with the kind of recognition reserved for lovers. He reached for her hand. She gave it freely. Together they walked into the lobby, heads bent close, laughter faint but audible through the glass. Linda's breath caught sharp in her chest. Her hands shook as she raised her phone, pressing the camera shutter again and again through the windshield. The images blurred slightly with the fog of her breath, but it didn't matter. They were there. Richard, Susan, the hotel sign glowing above them. Proof. For a long minute she sat frozen, staring at the empty space they left behind. Her heart thudded in her ears, her throat tight, her body locked between fury and collapse. This was no longer suspicion. This was fact, undeniable. And yet she didn't storm inside. She didn't fling open the lobby doors or scream across the parking lot. She understood something crucial. Confrontation gave power to the liar. In that hotel, they could spin excuses, cry, plead. But a photo? A timestamp? That couldn't be twisted. So she lowered her phone and snapped one final picture, the hotel sign glowing in the night, anchoring the betrayal to a place, a date, an hour. Documentation, evidence. Investigators call this the capture moment, when instinct meets proof and proof becomes a weapon. For Linda, it was also a moment of transformation. She was no longer the wife doubting in silence. She was the witness, the archivist of Richard's lies. As she drove home, her mind wasn't on heartbreak anymore. It was already on strategy. The retirement party was weeks away. Invitations mailed, catering booked, slideshow promised, and suddenly Linda knew exactly where her evidence belonged. The perfect stage, the perfect audience, and the perfect fall for a man who thought he could never be caught. When Linda pulled into the driveway that night, the glow of the hotel sign still burned in her mind. Proof sat warm in her purse, the photos of Richard and Susan hand in hand. The timestamp, the evidence no one could deny. Inside the quiet house, she hung up her coat, set her phone on the counter, and stared at it for a long time. She had what she needed, but what to do with it? For many, this would have been the moment of confrontation, an argument in the kitchen, an ultimatum, a slammed door. But Linda wasn't after apologies. She wasn't after promises that would never hold. She wanted something Richard valued even more than his marriage. She wanted his reputation. The plan came in fragments at first. A whisper of an idea as she replayed the hotel scene. A spark when she thought of the retirement party already set in motion. And then, slowly, it took shape. The slideshow. Every detail of the event had been meticulously arranged. Tributes from colleagues, speeches, the photo montage to cap the evening. Richard thought it would be a coronation of sorts, the crowning of his career. Linda realized it could be something else entirely, a trial. She volunteered to manage the slideshow, masking her intent with a smile. "You know how sentimental I get," she told her children, her voice light, convincing. "I'd love to pick out the pictures." Richard, smug in his double life, barely looked up from his paper before nodding his approval. He didn't suspect a thing. Over the next weeks, Linda built two versions of the presentation. The first was exactly what everyone expected: family vacations, the children growing up, company awards, photos of Richard laughing with colleagues. Warm, safe, sentimental. It was bait, designed to lull the audience into comfort, to convince them the evening would be nothing more than nostalgia. The second version was something else entirely. Into that file, Linda wove the evidence, piece by piece. A screenshot of the text message. "Love you. Can't wait for our next night together." The photo of Richard and Susan entering the hotel, hands entwined. The bracelet engraved with Forever SR. Even a bank statement she'd found showing a cash withdrawal that lined up exactly with the purchase of the bracelet. She timed it carefully. A family photo, a company achievement. Then suddenly the hotel shot, proof layered like thunder rolling in after calm. There would be no mistaking it. To hide her plan, she placed the files on separate USB drives. One labeled retirement memories she left in plain sight, the version her son would help her load onto the laptop early in the evening. The other, slim and unmarked, she tucked into her purse, wrapped in a silk handkerchief like contraband. That was the weapon. That was the truth. Meanwhile, she practiced her composure. Each morning, she stood in front of the mirror, rehearsing smiles until they looked effortless, smoothing her fury into calm poise. At dinners, when Richard muttered excuses about being late or helping Susan with this or that, she nodded softly, filing away the lies without a word. She played the role so well that even her children teased her. "Mom, you're over-planning again." She only smiled. True crime investigators call this stage pre-execution, the moment where the victim stops reacting and starts planning, quietly shifting into control. Linda was no longer passively gathering clues. She was architecting an event. The night of the party loomed closer, and with it, Richard's downfall. He thought it would be his grand farewell, a celebration of his career. Linda knew better. It would be the night his mask cracked wide open, and everyone would see what lay beneath. The evening unfolded like theater. Guests arrived in steady waves, laughter carrying through the grand hall as coats were collected, and champagne was pressed into waiting hands. The air smelled faintly of roses from the centerpieces, mingling with the aroma of roast lamb drifting in from the kitchen. A string quartet filled the background with soft harmonies, music that wrapped itself around every conversation like a velvet ribbon. At the head of it all was Richard, the man of the hour. He moved through the room with the ease of a general returning from victory, handshakes firm, smiles wide, shoulders squared. Friends clasped his back. Colleagues told stories of contracts saved, crises averted. To them, this was Richard's coronation, his reward for decades of loyalty. Linda lingered at the edges, her champagne flute untouched. Her satin gown shimmered under the chandeliers, her posture elegant and steady. Few noticed how still she stood, or how her eyes scanned the room with the sharpness of a hawk. To most, she looked like the perfect hostess, the proud wife preparing to honor her husband. Only Linda knew the truth. Tonight, she wasn't honoring him. She was unmasking him. Susan arrived late. She swept into the ballroom in a dark emerald dress that caught every flicker of light, her hair perfectly styled, her smile nervous but carefully pinned in place. To the crowd, she was simply the supportive sister, family, gracious, loyal. To Linda, she was the snake in silk. Their eyes met briefly across the room. Susan lifted her glass in a shallow toast. Linda returned the gesture with a nod so subtle it bordered on mockery. The program began with speeches. One by one, Richard's colleagues stood to recount his triumphs. They spoke of his work ethic, his knack for strategy, his loyalty. "The man with 9 lives," one joked, drawing laughter and applause. Richard beamed, basking in the glow, occasionally glancing at Linda with a smile meant to paint them as the perfect couple. Linda clapped at the right moments, her smile serene. To anyone watching, she was the picture of grace. But beneath the surface, her hand brushed against the small clutch at her side, the one holding the second USB drive. Every touch of the cool metal case steadied her resolve. Finally, the MC tapped the microphone. And now, a very special message from Richard's wife, Linda. The crowd erupted in applause. Richard's face lit with pride as he placed a hand lightly on her arm. "Knock 'em dead," he whispered. Linda rose with calm poise, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor as she walked to the lectern. A hush fell over the room. All eyes followed her. She stood tall, haloed by the chandeliers, her voice smooth and practiced. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began. "Richard has given 38 years of his life to this company, to his colleagues, to his family. Tonight we celebrate not just a career, but a legacy." The audience nodded, some raising glasses. Richard leaned back in his chair, smiling smugly, already savoring the words he expected: devotion, loyalty, gratitude. Linda continued, her tone warm but measured. "Over the decades, we've shared milestones together, raising children, building a home, supporting one another through triumphs and challenges." She paused, letting the sentiment hang in the air like a familiar tune. Then her voice shifted, still calm but sharpened with steel. "But a legacy isn't built only on accomplishments. It's built on truth. And sometimes truth doesn't look the way we imagine." A ripple of unease moved through the room. Richard's smile faltered. Susan's glass trembled slightly in her hand. Linda lifted the small remote. Behind her, the slideshow began. At first, it was exactly what everyone expected. Childhood snapshots, graduation photos, the young couple on their wedding day, vacations with the children, office celebrations. The room softened, murmuring approval, nostalgia warming their faces. Then the flicker. The screen shifted. A grainy photo filled the wall. Richard and Susan, walking hand in hand into the glow of a hotel lobby. Gas tore through the crowd. Someone dropped a glass. The shatter echoed like a gunshot. The next slide, the text message. "Love you. Can't wait for our next night together." Murmurs turned into horrified whispers. The next, the silver bracelet, engraved with Forever SR. The room dissolved into chaos. Chairs scraped. Voices rose. "Her sister?" someone exclaimed. Faces twisted with disbelief, then disgust. Colleagues who had just toasted Richard now stared at him as if he were a stranger. Richard shot to his feet, his face crimson, sweat beading on his brow. "Linda, what the hell are you doing?" he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of the evidence looming behind him. Linda didn't flinch, her voice cut clean through the noise. "I'm doing what you never had the courage to do, Richard. I'm telling the truth." She turned her gaze toward Susan, her eyes cold and sharp. "And you, my own sister, you didn't just betray me. You betrayed family." Susan's face drained of color. She rose shakily, stammering, It's not what it looks like." But her words drowned under the wave of whispers and accusations around her. Richard lunged toward the laptop, desperate to shut it down. But Linda raised her hand, her voice commanding, "No, Richard, you had your celebration. Now you face your judgment." She clicked one final time. On the screen appeared a family photo, Richard, Susan, and Linda smiling together at a barbecue. In this new context, the smiles looked sinister, mocking. The silence stretched heavy, unbearable. Linda set the remote down. Her final words were steady, deliberate. Enjoy your retirement, Richard. You've retired from me, from us, and from every ounce of respect you once had. She turned from the lectern and walked away, heels striking sharp against the polished floor. Behind her, chaos reigned. Gasps, sobs, shouts, the sound of glass breaking. But Linda never looked back. She didn't need to. The truth had already burned itself into the walls of the ballroom, and nothing would ever be the same again. For a heartbeat after Linda stepped down, silence held the room. The slideshow still glowed above the crowd, Richard and Susan frozen 10 feet tall in their betrayal. It was the kind of silence that falls after an explosion, when everyone waits to see what's left standing. Then the noise hit like a wave. Gasps turned into shouts, whispers into accusations. Chairs scraped, glasses tipped. Some guests fled toward the doors, muttering in disbelief. Others stayed rooted, staring at Richard as though seeing him for the first time. "Her sister?" one woman hissed. "All these years," another man muttered, shaking his head. Richard's voice rose above the clamor, desperate, ragged. "This is insane. She's lying. She's lost her mind." He gestured wildly toward the screen, toward Linda's retreating figure. But his words fell flat against the undeniable evidence still looming behind him. The hotel photo, the bracelet, the text, a jury of his peers, his colleagues, his family, had already delivered their verdict. Susan stumbled to her feet, her emerald dress swishing violently as she backed away. "Richard, don't! Just stop!" she stammered. But no one was listening. The crowd's disgust followed her like a shadow. "Shameful!" Someone spat near the door as she pushed past, her face pale as wax. At the head table, Richard's eldest son rose slowly, eyes locked on his father. His voice cracked, but it carried through the room like a sentence. "Dad, how could you?" Richard faltered, his mouth opening, closing, no words forming. The other children sat frozen, wide-eyed, their worlds split open in a single night. Longtime colleagues shook their heads. "Loyalty," one muttered bitterly. "All that talk about loyalty." One by one they drifted out, unwilling to watch the unraveling of the man they once respected. Richard tried to regain control, storming toward the lectern, tugging at his loosened tie. 38 years! 38 years of service, and this is what I get? Emotional blackmail?" His voice cracked into a shout, but the more he raged, the smaller he looked. Desperate, cornered, stripped of authority. Linda never turned back. She walked through the ballroom doors with her chin lifted, heels sharp against marble, her silhouette calm against the chaos she left behind. To those watching, she didn't look broken. She looked free. The house was silent the next morning. Too silent. No clatter of mugs, no rustle of newspapers, no voice clearing a throat before coffee. Only the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Each second a reminder that life had moved on, even as Richard's world collapsed. Linda stood in the kitchen in her robe, hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee. Through the window, remnants of the party lingered in the garden, half-deflated balloons, napkins caught on hedges, chairs stacked haphazardly by the catering crew. The echoes of last night clung like smoke. The gasps, the shattered glass, Richard's furious shouts, Susan's retreat. Her phone buzzed with messages, friends offering support, distant relatives sending shock, colleagues who had heard whispers. One text stood out from her eldest son. "Mom, I don't know what happens next, but I'm proud of you." Tears welled, not from grief, but relief. For decades she had carried the burden of silence. Last night she had traded it for truth. Upstairs, Richard's door remained closed. He hadn't come home until dawn, if at all. Maybe he was holed up somewhere, drowning in the ruins of his reputation. Maybe he was already facing the fallout. She had heard rumors in the messages. His retirement package might be frozen. His financial accounts flagged. Questions had already begun circulating in the company about misuse of funds, about how long the deception stretched. For Linda, it didn't matter. His chaos was his own now. She picked up the folded note Susan had once left behind. "I can't wait until forever." She unfolded it one last time, studied the curves of her sister's handwriting, then fed it into the fireplace. The flames licked at the edges, curling the paper into ash. Linda watched it disappear, her voice steady as she whispered, "Forever ended last night." The clock ticked on. Outside, sunlight broke through gray clouds, pouring across the wreckage of the garden. For the first time in years, Linda felt something steady. Not healed, not whole, but free. Richard's retirement had ended his career. Linda's truth had ended his lies. And somewhere in the quiet, she began to imagine a life not of routines and betrayals, but of her own making.